Well, my name is Commander Graham Bethune. I'm a retired Navy pilot, and I had a commercial rating before I came into the military. Went through the Navy's training, and when I was flying transports, we had a lot of the airline pilots that we recalled during Korea and things of that nature because they were in the reserve. And so I got an airline transport rating while I was in that squadron because I had flown every transport that the Navy had. And my transport rating is single engine land and sea, multi-engine land and sea, and then all the planes listed. Most of it I had. Okay, so that I flew the North Atlantic probably, I guess, including the seaplane, probably about 10 years. I started flying in 1940, and of course I learned that I got off the ground that everything they taught us was backwards, and I learned a lot of things that if you get off the ground to 400 or 500 or 1,000 feet and fly around this planet, you'll find out it is saturated with extraterrestrial evidence. But when you're flying at 35,000 feet in a cattle car, you don't see anything, you don't learn anything. So all of these things I learned quick because it was so different when you got off the ground. So I was, 1942, I had a mechanics rating, a commercial pilot's rating, and Admiral Reed, the man that flew the North Atlantic first pilot, 1919, he's the one that talked me into getting into the Navy. And because of my qualifications, didn't have enough college, so I had to take exam. But I went to the University of North Carolina, along with the older George Bush, along with Ted Williams, a famous baseball player. I could name a lot of, and guess who our athletic instructor was? Gerald Ford. So then I went through the regular Navy training program, but having a lot of flight hours and experience at that time, I just breezed right through it. It was very easy. Graduated from Pensacola, June 1943. That's the Academy of the Air, Cradle Naval Aviation. I volunteered because the Navy had started a navigation training program for just navigators. They didn't have any regular, all Navy pilots were trained navigators, and we navigated with the stars back in those days. I first left there and I went to a seaplane squadron in Rio. I'd always wanted to go to Brazil. And we flew 16 hours every third night hunting German submarines. During this period of time, of course, you see things down in the South Atlantic. No UFO chase teams, no particle beams, no satellites. You see things that were not hostile down in that area, so we saw a lot of things. In 1945, when I came back, I was on the search for the planes in the Bermuda Triangle. Then I went into transports, and I finally got an airline transport rating in addition to the Navy rating. So I was stationed at Patuxent River, Maryland, 1950, and we were flying a 4-engine, actually DC-4 R5Ds, and later the Super Constellation. They had a large meeting in Washington, D.C. in February, first part of February, 1951, where Eisenhower, who was the Supreme Allied Commander, was part of this meeting, and some of the NATO countries, and Vice Admiral Hugh Cotter, Radford, who would later become First Joint Chiefs of Staff. At this meeting, they had decided to provide Iceland with troops. So I was one of the two sent to Iceland to negotiate the logistics of flying troops up there. This was 1952, February the 5th. At the end of this meeting with Lockheed Overseas and Iceland, I said, could somebody explain to me why you requested troops? And this gentleman from Lockheed Overseas, he managed the airport, he said, well, we're seeing these big objects and the monsters, and they had lights, they didn't make any noise, they could disappear, and all these type of things. And God, I said, and I said, what kind of a wingspan? Oh, no, they were round, they were circular. So when he said that, I said, oh, hell, you know, we don't have anything like that because I fly out of a naval tester. We test all, and we know everything on the drawing board. I said, what did our government tell you they were? They said, your government said they were possibly experimental Russian bombers. So we all laughed. So I was the pilot, but we took off at night. and the skies were clear. And if 1,400 and some nautical miles, about 300 miles outside of Argentia, Newfoundland, which is right here. I saw like a city on the water in a distance. And of course, you can't make out any lights, but it was a pretty good sized city. I said, what the hell is this doing out in the middle of the ocean? So I checked with the navigator, and he said, well, it just took a 3-star fix. We're on course, and we're not near Iceland or Labrador, and we got a 60-knot headwind. And that was it. So he knew where we were. We passed over the weather ship, which gives you the weather report. And part of the weather report in that part of the hemisphere is the northern lights. If there's any northern lights activity, they tell you. There were no northern lights activity. So here we sit. We're sitting looking and seeing, what the hell is this? As we get close to this city, we start to see lights, big circle of lights. What the hell are they doing out here? I thought maybe the Navy was recovering something, secret. So as we get closer, there were very defined lights, a dozen or so of them, monstrous circle. And this was 45 miles away. This was about 30 miles away. And then when we got about 15, 20 miles away, the lights went out. Of course, all the heads were behind me, the crews, whatever, looking at what the hell happened. And so in maybe a minute, we didn't see anything. So what the hell happened here? Somebody turned the switch. Next thing we saw was on the water was a little yellow halo in the center, where it was really been in the center, where whatever it was that was launched came from under the water, or it came from a large craft on the water. Now, we were about 15 miles away at that time. This thing, the yellow halo, whew, like that, 15 miles in a fraction of a second. I disengaged the autopilot to push the nose over because we were at a collision course. And when I did, I just saw it head on. It's 300 feet in diameter. We knew that. We had a knowing, like somebody was telling us, 300 feet in diameter. So at that time, I heard a hell of a noise. And I said to Fred, what the hell was that? He said, well, the navigator and the radioman ducking fell, hit their head, one hit their head, hurt their arm, they were scrambling on the deck. So I thought it hit us underneath. So I said, well, where in the hell did it go? And Fred said, it's right over to the right. I can see it. I couldn't see it. So it drifted forward about 5 miles from it. It never got to the altitude that we were at, a few hundred feet below. And so I began to watch it. Well, we knew then it was a friendly encounter. They just wanted us to see him. So then I went to engage the autopilot again. The magnetic compass was doing like this. And the bird dogs, which is direction finders, the two bird dogs, they were pointing right at this thing, just vibrating like this. So I told Fred, did you see that coming? He says, it was close, it was doing this. And so I went back to the vacuum operator. That's the old airplane, the vacuum operator, hydraulic operator control. So I go back to that. And so then we sat there and watched it for a while, because it just paced us, stayed with us. Al Jones, which was the original plane commander, took my seat. And it was still there. He was watching it. And as I was walking back aft, he decided he was going to chase it. And so he disengaged. When I get back aft, I wanted to see how the passengers do it. They're all on the right-hand side. They could see it underneath the wing. And then, I recognized the doctor back. He was a psychiatrist out of Bethesda Naval Hospital, plus a lot of other things. So I said, I better talk to him first. So Cornell said, did you see what we saw, Doc? He grinned at me and looked me straight down. Yeah, he says, yeah, that was a flying saucer. I didn't look at it. I don't believe in such things. So I went back, I said, Al, don't call anybody know anything. He'll lock us up as soon as we get on around. So he says, too late. I called Gander to see if they could track it by radar. I said, what'd they say? They said that we were the only aircraft in the area, and they normally say you're the only traffic in the area. And so we knew the cat was out of the bag. When we landed Argentia, they had flown the Air Force in, Captain Paulson, to interrogate. We had to wait on him. So, then we knew that they had tracked it by radar, or they wouldn't send anybody there. So that's how. So all made our reports. Then when we got back to Patuxent River over here, we had the intelligence Navy come down, and they didn't question any of the passengers. We had a lot of pilots in the passengers too. And they tried to question Dr. Moser, and I don't want to tell you his name, but he didn't want to talk about it, the doctor. So that, as a result of that, the Air Force had made their report. We had to make out individual reports, never saw each other's report. And it went to Washington Navy Intelligence. At that time, the Air Force, we had given them the flying saucer project because they wanted everything that flew, including my models. And so they had the whole thing. So it went from there, of course, through the chain to right back. Okay, here we go. Eisenhower was familiar with our encounter because he was a Supreme Allied Commander. He was familiar with all encounters in the North Atlantic. So when he was elected president, he wanted a briefing. That's your MJ-12 document. Vice Admiral Heugenkotter briefed him on what we knew here. So then, as a result, we found out that our encounter was orchestrated to show us what the Icelanders were seeing. And it took us a long time to figure that out. So they sent a group in from another universe. And I don't want to get too much in detail there, but it's very important. This group, this is the radar scope picture from the Air Force. This group, 21 craft, and they were checking us out. Their mind perceivers, they could tell your level of awareness and all this type of thing, whether you're ready for anything or what the fear is. All I can say is, this is an Air Force jet here. And those are saucers around. It's all organized out there, confederations, just like we have different things that organize. So they had to go to another universe that could communicate with us. We're so primitive, there's no way that they could ever communicate with us unless they had a group that come in that could come into the third dimension. Now, this group, this photograph was August the 13th, 1952. And there were 68 craft. These are the ones that did actual communication with our leaders. And of course, Eisenhower wanted proof of something. And of course, he wanted to go out into space. He wanted to go to the other side of the moon to see the bases on the dark side of the moon. So here again, they could not do that. They had to get a hold of the Palladians. They have a Palladian connection, which have been here with us for many years. So the Palladians took him from Muroc, which is now Edwards Air Force Base, out to the other side of the moon. Adros was the commander of that ship. This is where the decisions were made, because each time that they meet with our presidents, they tell them that they have to get rid of their atomic weapons, or they will not share any more technology, because we make a weapon out of everything that they give us. So that was what was told to Eisenhower. Well, he had doubts, here again, the military-industrial complex, about whether he could pull anything like this, disrupt the economy, according to him, and he was afraid of our neighbor Russia at the time. You know, well, they said, we'll take care of that. So as a result, the crew on the ground made some big mistakes. They were going to confiscate these craft, and so that they turned around and came back. So Eisenhower did not sign with a good group. He finally signed with another group. So that's how that all ties in. Now, how do I know a lot of this? I was flying. When Eisenhower became president, the man that relieved him was Admiral McCormick, and that's who I was flying for a little over a year. And of course, you learn a lot from the age. You don't get a chance to talk to him. And this is my aircraft here. It's a sleeper. It's a real pleasure, just like Harry Truman's Sacred Cow. And so that's what I was flying, and so I had kind of first-hand knowledge on a lot of these things because I eventually had a top-secret clearance. And the people that I met with their age and everything as a part of the party, they were involved in all this. So that's how my encounter really fits in with the overall scheme. And I knew about this, but I was never told or threatened. My wing commander called me in, and he wanted to explain. I explained it to him. He says, "Look," he says, "you know that's one thing that you don't talk about, not even to your wife." Well, that was enough for me. I'm in the military. If it was national security, that's what I was there for. So I never did talk about it. And when I got to Detroit with the Bureau of Aeronautics, I was amazed at how many people knew about him. So I finally broke down and talked the vice president of Ford Motor Company, and Tex Colbert, the president of Chrysler, a few of them in secret. That's when I first started. So Major Kehoe had contacted my boss, who was the aeronautical engineer, because we spent a lot of time at Wright-Patterson. And my boss was used to go through the Project Blue Book and all the societies he had because of his knowledge in aeronautical engineering. And he found our report. And he couldn't understand why I didn't want to see it or why I didn't want to see what was at Wright-Patterson. I said, well, I can't ever talk about it, so I wasn't really worried about it. This is my report. These documents here you can see are out of the archives. They accidentally hid it, and they couldn't find it. They put in Project Twinkle. And so my boss had found it down at Wright-Patterson, so I knew it existed. And that's the first time I knew what speed that they tracked it at radar. They tracked it in excess of 1,800 miles an hour. So the weather report and everything else I found out, but I didn't find a radar report. So based on that, I've got the whole history in here, Major Kehoe's report to Congress. I've got Vice Admiral Healing-Cutter's report in Major Kehoe's book that he was going to go before Congress with it. I've got Kehoe's book, Flying Saucers, Top Secret. The whole first chapter of Flying Saucers, Top Secret is devoted to our encounter. They didn't fortunately mention our names. They gave us a fictitious name because we were still on active duty. So they were still after me to go forward. And so when Vice Admiral Healing-Cutter finally gave in to the Air Force, I thought, well, you know, I'm just not going to say anything. I first told somebody, it was Michael Hessman, because all the astronauts would go to London, go to Germany to give their story because they couldn't give it here. So that's how it got to be known. And then the young kids on a computer found Timothy Good's report. Incidentally, his report that he got was declassified under an executive order, whereas the Air Force had a regular downgrading every so many years, you know. And so it's everywhere I looked, it's in every kind of book that you can imagine. I even got a copy recently of a comic book, so that makes it official. It's as long as it's in the comic book. What happened is I had a home at Pawtucket, about 50 air miles from here, and I was working on a room. I didn't have a TV on, and it came on the news in his voice. And he said basically he knew that the people were concerned about what was flying over Washington, D.C., and that they could be assured that there's really nothing to worry about, that we know all about it. They're not here to harm us. Very short, maybe 3 or 4 sentences, and that was about it. So which led us to believe in his statement, okay, the government knows what it is, that's all we care about. We trusted the government then. What the president said was right, so that's what happened. In reality, he had no choice. He could not really, without getting bumped off like Kennedy, have done anything other than what he did. And he thought maybe he could work it out, but it was really the military-industrial complex that he was up against, plus the people that have the money. So that's where he sat. Okay, my communication is not directly, I have never wanted it, because I think my credibility would really be destroyed pretty quick if I started talking about that. So my communications is with a lot of beings that have incarnated here from the Pleiades, Syria, Andromedas, and God knows what. And a lot of these are channelers too, or mediums. I don't take too much stock in that because anybody can communicate with them. A lot of them are disembodied spirits and they're looking for a body to get. So if you want to really communicate, that's usually who you get. But these beings, they do, if you're familiar with remote viewing, I know they're the top remote viewers. I've asked them for years, I was always told you could not remote view these things in our inner Earth because they're a different dimension. Not all of them, there's some third dimensions in our inner Earth, 237 cities. So my question always has been to them, if I come here in my ship and I've got a lot of work to do here, and I don't want to go back, which maybe 4 hours, four light years away is less than 4 hours in their craft. And I said, I got an inner Earth base now. In order for me to go in the inner Earth base, I got to raise my vibrations or frequency. Can you find my base? And every one of them said, the top one says, yes, we can remote view base. I was always told that you couldn't because you couldn't see anything in another dimension. He says, that's not true. I said, well, why won't we hear from you? He said, well, to start with, nobody would believe us. The second thing, nobody, we don't have any proof of it. We can't show anything because they're a different dimension. So that bugged me. I thought, well, now, here these guys can tell me what we saw. It came from a submarine base, our encounter. That's where they were based. Two different universes had that particular. So through dealing with the Pleiadians at 23rd dimension and up, they can travel through the black holes, 500. These people here were 333 dimensions. And they can travel that way. Well, since that's the case, their remote viewing is energy. The thing is that, as I said, when we were down in the South Atlantic, we were seeing things that we'd never seen before. And we wouldn't even mention it to each other. In other words, if I mentioned it to the co-pilot, I would be afraid that he wouldn't want to fly with me anymore. In the same way. And so about all the pilots, every time I got in, after we retired and we had these reunions, is when we started talking about what we were seeing. But if you fly any period of time, now I'm not saying 35,000 feet in the cattle car, I'm saying down low where we were flying. And if you navigate with the stars, you're constantly seeing things in the heaven. So back in the days I was flying, it was very common. My dad was in World War I. When I told him about the Foo Fighters, he says, explain those Foo Fighters to me. He was over in France, Eddie Rickenbacker, so I'm a mechanic. I was explaining, he said, oh hell, we call those Kraut fireballs in World War I. And some of like Frank Edwards, a lot of these people could tell you stories more, they saw more than we did. So these things have been around since we have about 8.5 million years. They brought us here.
I am Jaime Maussan. I am a Mexican journalist. I have worked as an investigative journalist since 1970. I've been working in the Mexican television in Televisa since 1972. I became the head of the program 60 Minutes in 1985. I worked there since 1980 as a reporter. I was able to present probably 200 or 300 documentaries, an hour-long documentaries, over that 17 years. Because of that, I received 3 times the National Award on Journalism in Mexico, and a special recognition from the Capitol Hill in Washington, and a special recognition by the UN because of my achievements in the protection of environment with the Global 500 Award. Since then, since 1991, I've been working with the UFO phenomena in Mexico that is really happening every day somewhere around the country. But what has been more important for me is that this flap has been recorded in video. It means that we have evidence to prove that something is really happening in the Mexican Republic. I realized in 1991, in the total solar eclipse, when many people recorded UFOs, that the video camera had become the most important instrument to really capture this new reality. I believe because it was in the hands of so many million people in Mexico and around the world. With time, we would be able really to prove that this was an absolute reality. And that I can tell you, after 14, 15 years, that we think we have been able to at least prove that something weird, strange is happening in Mexico. Even the Mexican Army, the Air Force in Mexico, recorded UFOs. That the video was given to me, and I released that to the world. With that video, we were able to prove that not just the regular citizens, but even the very sophisticated planes from the Air Force in Mexico, planes that are used to capture narcotics in the south area of the country, they were also able to record these strange objects. In that case, that happened on March the 5th, 2004, the soldiers were able to record something that they couldn't see with their own eyes. And that's amazing. That was the first time someone recorded something that they weren't able to see. In July 17, 2004, a very young man, which his name is Pedro Avila, was able to record one object with two different cameras over the same tripod. But with one of the cameras, with the camera with the normal spectrum, he couldn't see the object. But he was able to see the object through the infrared camera, very similar to the video recorded by the military. That proves that even sometimes there are objects that we cannot see with our own eyes, but they are there, they are watching us. In the last months in Mexico, after thousands of videos, since the end of 2004, probably August 2004, we have been registering some of the most spectacular videos from the last 15 years. In some of these videos, one recorded in June the 10th, 2004, the other June 21st, 2004, you can see hundreds and hundreds of objects making formations and flying together, exactly the same thing that you can see in the military video. These formations moving at the same speed, in the same direction, at the same altitude. In June, we recorded these two videos, and again, in I believe was February 27, we were able to record 120 objects flying more than 400 kilometers an hour, probably 300 miles an hour, over Mexico City. The video is very spectacular. Again, in October 27, 2004, we were able to record a huge creature, probably 500 meters long or 300 meters long, releasing hundreds of spheres. This creature is what we could call a dragon or a serpent, a flying serpent, over the skies of Mexico City. Even was so big, huge, I say, this wasn't, the radar wasn't able to capture the image of this serpent in the sky of Mexico City, very near downtown Mexico City. The same kind of creature was recorded again in November 20th, 2004. Regarding the sightings in the Yucatan Peninsula, we had been able to get two incredible videos with a circular shaped object with lights. In both cases, it's exactly the same. Many people have seen this object in the Yucatan Peninsula, in the Yucatan area. And it's amazing because this appeared after the 3rd of August 2004, exactly when we had this Mayan calendar in England. We believe both events are related for some reason. We believe the Mayan calendar that we saw in England, it's some kind of advice to tell us that the end of the Mayan calendar is very near in 2012. And we believe that probably in 2012 something is going to happen. We don't believe in the destruction of the world, of the human beings. We believe in a change. Probably the rising of the sea level, as we heard in the news just 10 or 15 days ago, when it was announced that if the melting of the ice caps continues, by 2012 we will have the first problems with the rising of the seas, especially in the city areas like New York, Miami, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and in many other areas in Mexico, Cancun, Veracruz, Acapulco, and probably just around the world. As you know, has been predicted that many islands are going to disappear, and this is not debatable. It's a scientific truth. For that reason, we think that at this moment we should be trying to understand what this presence means, because so far we have been just discussing if it's real or if it's not real. And I think it's time to pass to a different level. And that level is trying to understand what is going on, what is happening. We have enough evidence, and I can prove that with data and knowledge of the existence of the phenomenon. We believe it comes from out of this world. We cannot prove that, but we believe it's from somewhere else. And we believe it's trying to communicate with us. On January 14th, 2004, we had this big flower in the sky. 6 objects making a flower, a huge flower in the sky. Nobody has been able to explain that. Just 15 days later, in January 31st, 2004, we had 6 objects making a delta formation over Mexico City. Probably spheres making this delta formation. For all those reasons, we think we should try to understand again what is happening. On March 31st, 2003, we had an incredible sign in the volcano Iztaccíhuatl, where we saw somehow a message in all Hebrew. This message was sent to Israel, and the answer we received is that said something like, on the 9th, the dragon will be born. That has been analyzed by the people who made the Bible code, and they have explained that the dragon is the one that brought the knowledge to the old Hebrews, and that the 9 is probably a region in the world. Then probably that region is Mexico, because Mexico has a serpent in the flag, in the symbol, national symbol. We love the serpents from the old cultures with Quetzalcoatl or Kukulkan, excuse me. We also have the largest numbers of species of serpents in Mexico. For all that reasons, we believe that probably what that message said is, in Mexico, the knowledge will be born. And that is amazing when you connect that to the incredible activity we have been watching in many different cities in Mexico. Even the people in the tower of control of the airport in Mexico know about this. The pilots know about this. But outside Mexico, very few know what is really happening. We have to remember that on February 14th, 2000, a huge UFO landed in the middle of the school near downtown Mexico, that at least 12 policemen saw very near this thing, that we have official papers recognizing that this really happened. Even 7 journalists that were with the policemen can witness that they saw this object landing in the middle of the school, which proves that really something is going on in Mexico. We have also new videos from that same area in the city, Azcapotzalco, where you can see these huge objects flying around that place. That's what I can tell you about what is going on in my country. And I hope what is important is to look to the evidences, analyze, and I think it's time for the scientists and the academics to go take a good look what is happening there. I believe because the activity is so intense that it's going to grow. I believe something is going to happen in Mexico. I don't know if it's because the people are ready for a contact or even before communication. We are ready to send new information to the cosmos as Frank Drake and Carl Sagan did on November 16, 1974. We have developed, with the help of some scientists, information to be sent to the stars. However, we haven't found the facilities or the possibilities to do it. Then I think if we can receive some help from investigators and scientists and people from other areas in the world, we could start some kind of communication. I don't want to sound crazy because this reality is almost fantastic. It's almost like fiction, but it's real. Fortunately, we have been able to get all this information in tape. We now in Mexico have produced 3 different cases where you can see creatures being photographed with digital cameras. These pictures were taken by very simple people. When you present them, it's very easy to debate them because when you see something that is not human, you say, it's not true. But they were taken by, one was taken by a 14-year-old kid, the other was taken by a young man who is a professional in radio, and the other one is anonymous. But the 3 are incredible, and they tell you how close they are from us. And I think it's going to be more and more. And I think it's time to listen to them and try to establish this communication. We won't have any contact until we have communication. And we have to try to identify the signs, the signs that are in the sky and sometimes physical, to try to answer these signs. Otherwise, we are losing very precious time, because if really, as the Mayans said more than 1,000 years ago, something happens with a big change in the world, especially with the rising seas, we are going to suffer very much. I want to bring your attention to the next equinox on March 21st, because we have to remember that the old people in Mexico and North America like to measure the position of the sky. I mean, the position of the sun related to the earth, to know if our planet was in the right position. And very soon we will know if this tsunami earthquake didn't move the earth enough to create a new change, probably around the weather, the climate. That could also create more problems, as we see that everything seems to be changing with the global climate. And I believe that if we have a change in the seasons, then with all the carbon dioxide and the increasing activity of the sun, all of this together, it's going to create a very difficult future. I want to be humble. I don't want to try to look like something who doesn't know what is talking to, but that's the way it's really happening in Mexico. Because I work in the media, because I was a journalist, because they respected me and I had credibility, because I have a television show every Sunday night in prime time, 7 to 9 p.m., and it's national, and it's on the air. For that reason, I have been able to change in many ways the perspective of Mexicans who are now starting to believe that something is really going on. Even very serious people, even very academic people, even some scientists are now watching to the new evidence with new eyes, and I think it's the time to do that. And that is why, well, I call the attention to them and others to investigate. Don't believe my words. You have to be very skeptical about what I say, but you should be investigating, otherwise you are not a scientist. I mean, that's the problem now. Everybody thinks that they know what is going on. They know that this phenomenon is not true just because they want to believe it's not true, but they are not investigating, and that's the problem with the scientists. They remind me of those who didn't want to see through the telescope of Galileo because they knew it was not true. Why should I lose something that is not true? That's exactly what the scientists are doing now. I mean, they don't want to look at the evidence, and that's when it's very difficult to prove anything, because they don't look, they don't say. But now, when I have this chance to hit the conscience every week, every Sunday night in Mexico, things are now changing and moving. And with that program, I am receiving the evidence all around the country. It's like a magnet. And very soon, through that media, through that program, we're going to present probably the most impressive evidence ever.
I'm Richard Souder. For several years, since about 1992, I've been researching underground bases, and in recent years also the topic of underwater bases and tunnels, understood clandestine facilities in these instances. I first got interested in this topic in a big way in the late 1980s when I moved out to the American Southwest to live and to study. And I heard people talking about this for the first time in my life as if these things really existed and in a major way. This was something little new for me, and it caught my attention. I pricked up my ears figuratively and literally, but I really didn't have time in my schedule to pursue these questions during that period. Well, after a few years went by, I did have a little more time in my schedule I had a little more free time, and I decided that I was going to examine the issue and see if there's any truth behind these questions. So I went to a good research library and started looking into some magazines and newspapers and government documents and so forth. And lo and behold, I discovered indeed there are underground facilities and installations operated by various agencies of the federal government and also major corporations. Well, I found that interesting, and I actually, in the summer, early summer of 1992, visited a few of these places, I believe almost all on the East Coast and Mid-Atlantic region. I didn't actually go underground. You can't do that without a security clearance. When I said that I visited them, I mean I did a drive-by, you know, drive down the road and look at the security fence. But I verified to my satisfaction that some of these things did exist. I wrote a short article on that subject for UFO magazine that's published out of Los Angeles, edited by Vicki and Don Ecker. So in the article I said, well, you know, I can't prove anything about alleged little aliens underground hurtling through clandestine tunnels and supersonic tube shuttle trains. But I can say that there are indeed underground installations operated by a variety of government agencies and also some corporations. So the article was well received, I thought. It appeared in November of 1992, and at that point I felt like I had very much been there and done all of that. I felt I had comprehensively covered the subject and discovered what there was to feasibly discover, and I was prepared to move on to other things, having scratched that itch. Well, the last week of 1992, just several weeks later, I was awakened out of a deep sleep. This was the week between Christmas and New Year's. And I lived alone, and there was no one in the apartment besides me. And I was awakened out of a deep sleep by a voice in my ear that told me very matter-of-factly, the underground bases are real, just like I'm saying it now. The voice speaking to me was right in my inner ear. The perception was much like if you're listening to a little transistor radio and you have that little plastic earpiece that you stick in your ear. It was a quiet little voice like that, distinct but not loud. So I had no problem hearing it. I was the only one there. It was the middle of the night. It was very quiet. It was just me and the quiet voice in the night. So that was quite an opening line, and of course because I had very recently written an article on the topic, it was clear to me immediately what the voice was talking about. And the voice went on to say, indeed there are underground facilities, installations, bases, and so forth, and that there are people living and working down there, carrying out projects and programs, and most people are unaware of this, but if they did know, they would be very surprised and amazed to know all that was happening. And he gave me, I say he because it was the voice of a man, it sounded like the voice of an adult male Caucasian speaking normally accented late 20th century North American English. In other words, it could have been any one of millions of men. And a well-educated voice. He was speaking standard English, grammatically correct, with a literate vocabulary. And he went on to tell me that indeed these facilities are there and there are people living and working down there. And I got the impression of quite a lot of activity and a large number of people and big facilities, really serious business. I also got the impression from what he told me that there were corporations involved, government agencies, and I remember laying there and in the dark just listening to this voice as if I was listening to a radio broadcast over transistor radio. And I was thinking, man, this is quite something. I wonder if it can be true. And of course I was thinking also as he was talking, who is this guy? And I didn't really wonder how I was hearing his voice. I already had a pretty good idea that it had to be some kind of electronic transmission. It never seemed purely telepathic. It never seemed like a a mind-to-mind transmission, so to speak, or brain-to-brain. It seemed, and I can't tell you exactly why, but it seemed, well, perhaps because it sounded like a radio broadcast. So much so that I was thinking it is some kind of radio transmitter he's using, only he's targeting my mind with it. I now know that indeed there are such electronic devices. This is not science fiction. In fact, I reproduced this patent in 2 of my books. It's called Hearing Device, but a more apt title for the patent would be Brain Transmitter. And indeed it describes a pulsed microwave electronic device by which intelligible sound, voice included, can be broadcast to the auditory cortex of the human brain. And I believe quite strongly that a device like that was used to transmit a very interesting broadcast to my mind. Well, that made a strong impression on me, needless to say, and when this gentleman stopped speaking, I, not having much else to do, went back to sleep. The next morning, I remembered clearly what had happened during the night a few hours before, and determined then and there that I was going to look into this. So I began a document search, methodical investigative research that really hasn't ever ended. I've been at it by fits and starts ever since. I now have a literal mound of documentation, books, articles, newspaper articles, information off the internet information from corporations, military documents, documents I got from the Freedom of Information Act, documents out of government archives, presidential archives, NASA archives, so many different sources, anecdotes from people, letters I've received anonymously in the mail, emails, casual conversations at conferences, and I've been as surprised at the number of times I've run into people face to face in the course of my everyday life who had pertinent information. I now understand there's a lot going on underground. Near the beginning of my research, I had people telling me, just so-called ordinary people, not people with any official government position or high station in the military or an important job for a major corporation, just the run-of-the-mill, so to speak, man or woman in the street that you would meet in the course of your everyday life. And people began telling me, Richard, you know, it's the United States Navy. They're the ones that are really heavily involved underground. And I was thinking, see, this was way back in the early 1990s. And I was thinking, you know, these are nice people, they seem well-intentioned, but you know, they're so addled. They just don't know what they're talking about because the Navy does have its sphere of influence and operations, and that's the deep blue sea. Well, I now understand that indeed those people may have known something about what they were talking about because I have found some documentation indicating Navy interest in going underground on firm land. And I cite one of those documents in a couple of my books. The one document comes out of the late 60s or early 70s, and it talks quite forthrightly about the Navy going underground, multiple levels down, because many of their installations on land are hemmed in. And while they have the entire sea to roam about when they're cast away from the dock, on land, true, their bases are limited in extent from the standpoint of the real estate that they legally control. So by going underground, they have access to more space. So from a purely pragmatic standpoint, they had a vested interest in doing that. And I picked up on that in one of the documents I found in my archival research. Well, subsequently, I ran across another document, none of this classified, by the way, an open source document from China Lake Naval Weapons Station talking about the rock site plans, plans for so-called rock site bases. And this is circa 1966 or so. And the idea was to go down under the deep sea, actually, well out to sea, and go down into the rock, the bedrock, beneath the sea floor, and to go down even hundreds, or maybe even 1,000 or 2,000 feet, down into that bedrock, there to make tunnels, hollow out, excavate big chambers for living and working, whatever the Navy does, including huge docks and berths deep under sea to pull in entire submarines or multiple submarines and dock them there along with the crews and use it as a base of operations way down there. And that was as of 1966. And the Navy was speaking of these plans as if they had the technological capability then. This is 40 years ago of doing this, of actually taking submarines into these bases undersea through huge pressure locks. And if you know, even then, the Navy's submarines, the big boomers, so to speak, were huge, hundreds of feet long, maybe 100 feet tall, 300, 400, 500, 600 feet long. These are very large vessels. And so we're talking about pressure locks, hundreds or even thousands of feet undersea that can accommodate these kinds of deep sea ocean going vessels. Now that's 40 years ago. I have to believe the technology has only gotten better since that time. Now I have gotten indications that there are facilities like this out there. It would be my guess. No one, I would say, and I want to be clear about this, no one has told me, whether in the Navy or out of the Navy, that they have built these types of facilities. But I've gotten scuttlebutt here and there, and from non-Navy sources as well. I want to make that clear, that deep sea manned facilities are out there, or should we say out and down there. Now what's happening in them, I don't know, but the indications that I get are some large and powerful corporations are involved, and certainly government agencies. I wouldn't limit this to the United States Navy at all. The information I have, not least of which the Navy's own documentation, strongly indicates their very real interest in doing that. So I'm guessing the Navy has done that. But I have other information that suggests that it's not only the Navy, but others as well, including ones you might not immediately think of. Now what's being done in these bases, whether deep undersea manned bases or the deep bases, secret bases on land, well those are big questions that I don't have ready answers to. I have some ideas. From the standpoint of UFOs, there's certainly many stories from abductees, and I might add some of these stories are pretty credible. I've talked to some of these people, and there are many stories of people being abducted into underground bases where they have seen, in some cases, UFOs or purported aliens or United States military personnel or other humans whose organizational affiliation is indeterminate. So this is a case where there are many questions. The answers don't come as easily as the questions, but I can assure you, I do have some answers, and I can tell you with 100% confidence that indeed there are underground bases, and there are clandestine underground bases, and that I have strong reason to believe that there's some highly unusual activities taking place in these secret installations, and I believe that that would be a major reason why they are secret. And I also have strong reason to believe that this underground base stuff exists and extends offshore beneath the sea bottom as well. Yes, well, as part of my archival research, I've run across, actually have, a couple of declassified Project Paperclip memoranda from 1947, from mid-June 1947. And both memoranda unambiguously request so-called German technicians, ex-Nazis understood, who were involved in a civil engineering capacity during the Third Reich. One of them, in fact, was one of Hitler's right-hand men, not so well known publicly as other famous guys like Speer, Goebbels, or Goering, but this guy was a high level, had a high level of responsibility and did a lot of the engineering projects during the Third Reich, and was specifically requested, along with other German engineering technicians, to come over I'm speaking Salvadorish, to come over to the United States to work on what the Air Force called in 1947 the underground plant program, which was then already underway. And his expertise and expertise of some other Germans was requested to help further that program and carry it out. Now you, like I, can speculate as to what was involved as far back as 1947 in the underground plant program of the United States military. I have some ideas. I think almost certainly nuclear weapons would have been involved in that, development, manufacture, research. I don't know that, I'm surmising that. The memoranda do not specify. But I would also surmise that there were almost certainly other secretive activities being carried out even then, for which they wanted, and were building, highly secure, super secret, deep underground facilities. And think about it, we're going back almost 60 years there. And as of that date, more than half a century ago, they already had these types of programs and projects well underway. So this type of activity has been going on for a long time. It's continued straight down through the years and decades. Well, you have to understand that German civil engineering technology in the 1930s and 1940s was very good. The Germans were quite good at underground excavation. They still are. And even before the beginning of World War II, the Germans had done quite a lot of underground excavation, underground tunnels, and building underground facilities, command centers, and military types of installations. They continued that during World War II and expanded what they had done before the war. It's amazing that under the onslaught and the savagery of a major war, and World War II was a tremendous conflict. It's amazing that under that type of duress, that the Germans were able to construct as many underground facilities as they did. But they did. How they did it, I can only tell you their engineering was quite good. Of course, during the war, they used a lot of captive slave labor. But even allowing for that, it's amazing. And what happened when the Americans went into Germany in 1945 and 46, when they invaded and defeated the Third Reich, and then militarily occupied a lot of Germany, not all of it, because the Russians, French, and English had their zones as well. But the Americans occupied a lot of the country, and they overran many of these installations and facilities, and realized early on what they had found. And it was amazing. Some of these facilities had miles of corridors and tunnels, living accommodations, working areas, electronics facilities, telephone exchanges, recreational facilities, and then there were also the deep bunkers for constructing and firing V-2 missiles and things like that. And so the Americans were quite amazed and impressed by this and other German engineering, and that was one of the reasons for Project Paperclip. The American Army said, we have to bring these guys over. What they did for Hitler, we want them to do for Truman. And it was so. It happened very quickly. They began bringing them over, one plane load after another, just wave after wave of Nazi engineers and scientists. It went on for years. And the memos I found pertained to a subsequent wave of multiple waves in 1947, requesting the presence of some experts, engineers, scientists that for whatever reason they hadn't evidently brought over to date, but wanted to. It was an ongoing program. It was not a one-shot deal. It went on over a period of years. And as programs and projects were started or developed or continued here in the States, evidently they were issuing memos that said, oh, by the way, and we want, you know, Dr. So and this and that engineer, and, you know, dozens of them in the memos that I've seen. And I did recognize 3 of the names who were definitely involved in major policies and programs here in the United States in the post-World War II period, which leads me to wonder about the other names on the lists that I don't recognize, but who undoubtedly were experts in their field and whom the Americans wanted. So That fact in itself leads me to believe that there were other programs, there were other projects that to this day probably remain classified and we don't know about. Project Paperclip had facets and implications and ran down trails that I'm still discovering, and look, we're more than half a century down the line. I think we can take some examples from some of the better known, well-known, publicly known underground bases, and there are a number of them that were built in the 50s and 60s. So already we're talking about technology that's basically half a century old. 50s and early 60s, we're talking about technology that's 40 to 55 years old. But even then, Mount Weather, for example, in Northern Virginia, now operated by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, can accommodate a couple thousand people, a literal town underground, with, in terms of water for the facility's use. They actually have small ponds that are hewn out of the water underground, and you can actually row rowboats around in them. They have miles of corridors and hallways and streets that get around with small electrically powered carts. There are sleeping quarters, recreation quarters, workrooms with supercomputers, radio studios. It literally is a self-sufficient small town, hundreds of feet underground, that was built half a century ago. Another example would be the Pentagon's alternate command center, which is deeply buried underground on the Maryland and Pennsylvania border, so-called Site R, or Raven Rock. It's a facility associated with Fort Ritchie. Here again, you have a large facility, virtually a self-enclosed small town deep underground. It's been there for decades, for years and years. It can accommodate several hundred people, over 1,000 people when they're buttoned up. I've even heard figures running up to 2,000 people. Another example would be the massive base underground beneath Cheyenne Mountain out in Colorado, the NORAD facility, which appears in popular films, feature films from time to time, which is also quite large, which has actually virtual office buildings underground on huge shock springs that weigh thousands of pounds. And these stories are multi-story buildings underground, and this is another facility that can accommodate a couple thousand people and has supercomputers, sophisticated electronics, living quarters, working quarters. And those would be three examples of very large, huge underground bases that are really self-contained, high-tech small towns. And we know of those from the public record. There are others like that are classified. I know this from my own research. How many? I don't know. Exactly where? I don't know. But I can tell you with 100% conviction and confidence that these places exist. And what's happening to them? I don't know. I don't know. But I can tell you from my research that in these super secret, deeply buried, large clandestine facilities, there are unusual activities going on. That I can tell you. I just don't know exactly what those unusual programs and projects are. You know, I started looking into maglev trains some years ago because the stories, the rumors that keep surfacing about an alleged deep underground, super secret, super high speed train system or tube shuttle transportation system here in North America. These stories are very persistent. And when I first heard them, they seemed fantastic to me. I didn't know much about maglev technology when I started. I guess I knew the word, and I had a concept of what was involved from an informed layman's perspective, but I really had no idea as to whether these things were being built or what the extent of planning for them might have been. I know that if you look around the United States, you don't see high-speed maglev train transportation systems. They're not here. They weren't 10, 15 years ago, and they're not here today. So I knew the term and had a general idea of what was involved, and that was about it. So people said, however, that these things were in use secretly, deep underground, like a coast-to-coast red-eye shuttle for the exclusive use of top secret use of clandestine military projects and alleged aliens that they're working and consorting with. I thought those were incredible stories, and just to say it now, it still sounds incredible. And I can't tell you that that's happening. What I can tell you is, lo and behold, during my research on underground high-speed elevators, and they do exist, there are elevators that go underground pretty fast, through a somewhat circuitous trail, paper trail, I discovered that way back in the 1930s, in 1938, when the Third Reich was just getting rolling, that there was a German engineer by the name of Hermann Kemper who took out Reichspatents for this. And I have them. I have the old German patents. Back in the 1930s, he was given patents for a supersonic, underground, maglev, tube train shuttle that the Nazis were planning to build way back in the 30s and 40s. And this actually appeared in the German popular press. Not only did this man get official government patents from the Third Reich, but he also was written up in the popular press of the day, and he actively researched it, including during World War II. And the research continued after the war, was taken over by the British and the Germans themselves, and to a lesser degree, at least officially, the Americans. Not only that, but as of the period 1939 to 1943, he was actively working on trying to engineer a system that would go, and keep in mind this is over half a century ago, 1,200 miles per hour underground through these magnetic levitation tube shuttle trains. The idea was you would make a tunnel underground, you would seal it off and evacuate the air so that you would have a pneumatic tunnel that you could run a train through at high speed, but then you wouldn't have air friction. You wouldn't have friction, which would make it much more efficient. You wouldn't have to worry about heating up the train from friction, like the space shuttle has to worry about when it re-enters the Earth's atmosphere, because you'd be moving at a very high rate of speed. And it'd be so much more efficient, and you'd get rid of the friction from the rails, because it would be riding on an electromagnetic field. And this guy was, I don't want to say he was way ahead of his time, because German engineering in the 30s and 40s was very good. He thought he could do it. He was working on it, and I think the Nazis thought he could do it too, because the research continued right through the war. And of course, since the Americans were scouring Germany for German technology, engineers, scientists, and since this guy had official patents, since he had a laboratory and was working on this during the war, and since it was written up and openly in the German popular press in the late 1930s, I'm more than certain that the Project Paperclip guys would have gone looking for this. They certainly were aware of it. It was out there. So did they bring Hermann Kemper to the United States? I can't tell you they did, because I don't have any documentation of that yet. However, he died in 1971. He did not disappear after World War II. He was in public circulation. He had a life and a career after the war. It would be my guess that he was either, if he was not brought to the United States under paperclip, it would be my guess that he would have been extensively debriefed by the military occupying authorities, American understood. Now, it's interesting to me that exactly the same type of system that Hermann Kemper was working on before and during World War II pops up in the United States 30 or 40 years later in rumor fashion, just out there, so to speak, and people talking about it as if it exists, which leads me to wonder if the system that the Nazis intended to build was not in fact built here instead after World War II, using Nazi technology, plans, technical drawings, and so forth, just transplanted over here under great secrecy and then constructed under a top secret cover. I'm really wondering, I can't tell you that happened, but how very interesting to find plans in 1938, plans and patents in 1937 and 1938 that so very closely resembles. There's almost a 100% correspondence to what is described there and what is rumored to exist in this country, albeit in a very, very secret fashion. I think there are multiple motivations for going underground in such great secrecy. I've gotten indications that there's concern in high official circles about possible cataclysm coming up, maybe asteroid strikes, maybe destabilization of the Earth's rotation on its axis. In other words, destabilization of the physics of rotation of the planet. Certainly the geological record has plentiful evidence of geological upheaval in past ages. What's to say that won't happen again? Or that the climate may change, and indeed we know there is instability in the Earth's atmosphere. All of these things could make survival on the surface problematic, and you might want to have deep facilities in that eventuality for survival of a select few. Clearly preparation is not being made for survival of the masses on the surface in that event. The clear implication is that most people topside would be written off as collateral damage, and a self-selected, self-anointed elite would burrow away underground to ride out the upheavals. There also seems to be preparation for potential nuclear conflict, and again, in that scenario, clearly the preparation is not for the masses. Clearly under that scenario, we have been written off, and the self-anointed few would take their precious selves underground to survive and probably not lament our passing. And then you have the whole UFO and alien question. Certainly there's a lot of anecdotal evidence suggesting they're here, and that there's something going on underground, that some of them are underground, and that some of these facilities are being built for that reason. And other reasons. I mean, it seems from what I've read and what I've heard that there are some highly strange scientific and engineering projects that are going on, supercomputing, biological engineering, other things, perhaps even time travel types of technologies. I've heard and read some very mind-bending stories in literature. I think about it. If I can find confirming or corroborating evidence, I put it out there, but I have to be honest and say that in many cases, I don't know what's happening underground. I only know that there are some very secret facilities down there, and I have a lot of questions about the very high security. At the same time, we see a very aggressive foreign policy, especially on the part of the United States, invading other countries, militarily occupying them, spending a great deal of money to do that, investing huge amounts of large numbers of troops and a large quantity of war materiel to do that. Certainly there are also imperial factors at play here, factors of global and imperial military and political and economic control. That's certainly part of the policy mix as well. So there are many factors at play here. And economic, political, military, probably diplomatic, and other policy areas come into play here. Some of them obviously of a very top secret nature, and we can only speculate as to what's involved. So this whole policy area is not easy to research, it's not easy to understand. And at the end of the day, I can only say after several years of research, there's a lot going on underground. Some of it we can get at and say we know where the installations are and we have at least some idea of what's happening. In other cases, I have to honestly admit, I don't know precisely where the secret installations are. I can say with confidence, there are large, sophisticated, deep, secret installations on land, and also my evidence strongly suggests in a deep sea environment as well. And we don't tend to think about that, but remember the old adage, out of sight, out of mind. And that's one of the great security covers. If by going 500 feet or 3,000 feet underground on land, if you have a good security level of security by doing that, and you do, how much more so when you've got 2,000 feet of water yet on top of that, and you're a couple of 100 miles offshore, or maybe 1,000 miles. That provides yet another level of security. Not too many people are going to come into a facility like that uninvited. No, you'll go in on the terms of the people who build, maintain, and operate such facilities, or you won't go in at all. You'll either be invited there by them or taken there by them, but you are very unlikely to just go in independently on your own initiative. So these are very highly secure facilities. They're very secretive. They're very massively well-funded. They're high-tech facilities. They're large, and what is going on, it's ever so puzzling. You have to realize the nature of compartmentalized projects. It's so fragmented and compartmentalized. They'll bring, I mean, I talked to a guy who helped build one of the first underground bases out west in the late 40s and early 50s. And he said when he went in, he was a hard rock miner for the federal government his whole life, working on underground projects for the feds his whole life. Most of them weren't clandestine, but at least one was, and he told me about it. It was clandestine at the time he built it. It's now pretty well known publicly. But he said he would go in and his group would make one room or one chamber or one tunnel, and then they would be pulled out and taken to another part of the project. So even though they were the miners who built this place, when they finished, the guys that actually made it didn't know what it looked like. You follow me? Yep. Because they would be taken, when they were taken in, their eyes were blindfolded. Of course, blindfold was taken off while they worked. But when they left, again, they were blindfolded. If they were taken to another part of the facility while they were in transit, they were blindfolded. So even the guys who build these things don't really know what it looks like. That's the extent of the compartmentalization, even in the late 1940s. And I got to believe it's even gotten tighter since that time. And then, of course, they would all of them, even the iron workers, would have security agreements. And if you go running your mouth in bars around town, you know, very few people want to spend X number of years of their life in the penitentiary or worse. How would you like to be slave labor for the rest of your life underground? You know, I talked to a guy who was in one of those, he was in the military, this was years ago, back in the 60s, I believe, and he actually described being stationed, I think, at a place called Ice Station Zebra. It's up in the polar region, and he said they flew in on a C-130, a skip equipped with snow skis, and they landed on this, in this vast white tundra environment. It was just ice and snow to the horizon. And so he said they flew in, the C-130 banked sharply, and they went spiraling down, and they disembarked, and they went down like a stairway, cut right in the ice. And there was like a little military town there under, excavated down in the tundra. And he described to me, he was in like on security patrols. He was part of security. So he had this young guy in, I forget, it was the Army or the Navy, I forget which. But he said they would send them up topside, bundled up in parkas and goggles. And he said it was so cold you couldn't hear yourself think. And they would rope them all together on a tether so they wouldn't get lost. And the wind would be howling and the snow would be blowing. And he said you could barely see the guy in front of you. And they were sent up to patrol. And he said, Richard, I never figured out what we were patrolling, but they would go up with their M16s and patrol. And he said he couldn't see anything, and it was so cold he didn't know what to do. And they'd go up and patrol, and then they'd go back down. Do have a two-tiered system, if you will. There's the old government, what Richard Dolan would call the old Republican government, and then we have the so-called new imperial national security state, which operates under a different set of terms entirely, and different set of rules. And they actually have two different funding sources. A national security state, much of which is very secretive and operates in a rogue, clandestine fashion, has trillions of dollars of off-budget, black budget funding at its disposal, which it does not account for. And it operates basically outside the purview of the constitutionally mandated system of checks and balances under which the so-called old Republican form of government is supposed to operate, whether or not it does. So in effect, you could say, yes, we really are under two governments, two competing governments, And the national security state, the imperial state, is doing its best to put the old, if you will, Republican government, constitutionally mandated government, out of business. And that agenda has been underway for at least a half a century. It is well advanced. My website is www.souderzone.com. And anyone can go there. I have some material up there. People can buy books through my website. And I do have 3 books. The first book is Underground Bases and Tunnels, and it's heavily based on government documents and archival research and information I got from the Freedom of Information Act from the American government. The second book is Kundalini Tales. That deals more with electronic mind control, spiritual, and esoteric phenomena. And then the third book is Underwater and Underground Bases. Again, heavily based on archival research, United States federal government documents, and documentation from the scientific and military literature, military documents, and so forth, as well as anecdotal information. I must say that over the years I've had a surprising number of people come forward affiliated with the military, and also just civilians who've never been affiliated with the military, whether uniform military or non-uniform military. And I've gotten some very interesting information from people, and continue to do so all the time. People give me very interesting nuggets of information. A lot of people in this society have bits and pieces of information relating to what's going on underground and undersea. But because these projects are compartmentalized, the information is spread out all over the place. And one person may have one part of the puzzle, another person may have another part of the puzzle. It's very rare to find a person who has a whole section of the puzzle in his or her possession and is willing and able to talk about it. That is a rare day indeed, let me assure you.